So the mood in Beijing was much gloomier than any of us sensed at the time. Probably because Bob and I were very close to getting our book leave, and we were also personally had an interest in seeing a deal. So we were just blindly optimistic about this as well. But anyway, so all joking aside, so something entirely different happened in China. Let me just take a little step back and explain a little how the Chinese system works. So obviously it is very different from the US system, and it's steeped in secrecy, very little visibility into what the top leadership is doing. So as time went by and we were able to get a little bit more detail about exactly what transpired in April of last year that caused the talks to collapse. So one thing was, yes, President Xi Jinping has established himself as the most powerful and assertive leader in recent Chinese history, but even he still, doesn't have absolute power. If you look back at Chairman Mao and Deng Xiaoping, they didn't have absolute power either. Always for years, for decades, the Chinese top leaders always try to seek consensus, among their colleagues, before they take significant or drastic actions to do something. And the U.S.-China trade deal would fall into that category. There's nothing else more important, few other things more important to China's leadership these days than this U.S.-China relationship. So of course, Xi Jinping can't just go it along and sign off on the deal without consulting with the other members of the Standing Committee and the Politburo. So we found out that there was a very big Standing Committee meeting that took place before the American negotiators came to Beijing for another round of negotiations in early May. So during that meeting, the support for the deal was tepid at most. 3 members of the committee actually voted yes, and 3 voted no. It all came down to President Xi Jinping himself. So hardly a consensus at the time, very split. And at the time, the top leader himself also kind of got cold feet. He just came back from touring Europe. Everybody was murmuring into his ears that, we hope that whatever deal you cut with the Americans wouldn't divert purchases from our countries. And the Belt and Road Forum at the time was a huge success for President Xi. Also, despite the U.S. boycott, a lot of other countries joined. And also, very importantly, the Chinese economy had stabilized by that time. That was a very important factor. So the Chinese side felt like time was on their side. And what, for them, it was, and then the top leader just told his negotiator, Vice Premier Liu He, push harder. We can't accept the draft as it is written, and tell the Americans that, of course, we're going to do some reforms, change some regulations, laws to better protect IP, but we cannot be seen as caving to the U.S. pressure. So that's what happened. Then Vice Premier Liu He, during the meetings with Representative Lighthizer and Mnuchin, he just said, I didn't have the mandate to cut a deal. The draft of the agreement couldn't have been accepted as written. The message back from the American side was, okay, pick a chapter and mark up, but make as little changes as you can. I think it was, I can't remember the date, but it's in the book. Sometime either very late April or early May, it was a Friday, the Chinese side sent back the revised version and basically crossed out a third of that IP chapter that just didn't sit well with the American side. So that's what really transpired in Beijing. There are two telling signs that in hindsight, I felt like I should have paid more attention to. One of the telling signs was sometime in April, Vice Premier Hu Chunhua, who's in charge, a Politburo member and also in charge of trade, in charge of foreign investment and trade too. So he told a Japanese delegation that he was not sure at all that the U.S.-China could cut a deal anytime soon. Now, that comment actually happened before all the optimistic remarks made by senior officials in Washington. And what he said was the Americans just making one demand after another. They don't feel like they can accept that. So that was one telling sign. And the other telling sign that came a little bit late was already after the standing committee meeting and all that was also very early in May. There's a very influential and also official social media account. It's called Taoran Note. Taoran Note is run by the Economics Daily. It's a state-owned newspaper, directly reports to State Council. So absolutely what was written in that article reflected what the top leadership was thinking at the time. The little blog post just reads like, if one party only considers its demands and thinks it can use extreme pressure to force the other party to submit and ignore fairness, then there's not any other possibility than breaking up. So those, in hindsight, those were really two telling signs that I wish I had paid more attention to while I was reporting on the trade war. So anyway,
my perception of it is that there was a misunderstanding on both sides in terms of where we were in the negotiations. On the U.S. side, we clearly thought we were at the end game, and that this was going to be basically one of the last meetings we had before we signed text. And I think China didn't necessarily perceive it that way, and they thought that there was more room for negotiation, that there was more patience on the U.S. side than there really was. But what I think that illustrates is what's really important to how we move forward with China. And what I learned as a negotiator is something that I didn't know 3 years ago. And I think, like a lot of policymakers in the United States, I had this view of China as being monolithic, as being disciplined, of having this plan of how they were going to push back on the United States and dominate our industries with Made in China 2025. And the reality is much different than that. And I can recall times, I remember when I was in Beijing, it was in February of, I got to think of the year now, as Wendy said, it all blends together. February 2019, and we were in Beijing talking about some of the trade secrets text and what role the courts would play and wouldn't play. And there were folks there from the judiciary in China, and then there were folks from MOFCOM, and they literally started arguing with each other at the table in front of the U.S. team about what concessions they were and weren't going to make. And it just shocked me and blew me away. And I think what your book does, and what I really think is needed in Washington, is a greater appreciation of the differences within China. And we need, in order to move forward with China and achieve some of our goals with China, we need to understand those differences. And then, in my opinion, try to take advantage of them to achieve our different ends. But I think the Washington view of China is very monolithic right now, and I think your book does a great service to that. I could go on for a while here. Let me just comment on a couple of things that were just said that I think I wanted to mention. The first on the business community, I do think we did try to pay more attention to the business community's objectives than maybe is understood. And maybe I say that because I'm one of the folks in the administration who always reached out to the business community to try to understand exactly what they were thinking and incorporate that into there. But it starts from the very beginning in terms of the way the tariffs were designed was intended to spare our business community and place the impact more directly on China's. And the way that the provisions that we asked for, the things we asked for, were all derived from USTR's year after year engagement with stakeholders, whether it's through the NTE or through other processes with China. And so we knew very clearly exactly what the business community wanted. And so I do think that that critique is maybe a little bit off base.
So I think there are people in that administration, the Trump administration, that believe that China, the rise of China, is the most significant threat, I should say, most significant threat to the U.S. since the rise of fascism. People like Peter Navarro, Matt Pottinger, Lighthizer to some degree, but Trump isn't one of those. That's not what he thinks. And then there are people in that administration, where Clete would be closer to this, I think, who think, yes, China's definitely a problem. There are things that we haven't resolved and we should have, but you know, we have to worry about the global economy. There are lots of other issues out there, and Trump isn't one of those either. And he sort of ping-ponged back and forth. And so, as one example, for instance, after we were talking about the so-called reneging, the April blow-up, so Trump is very angry, and John Bolton uses that anger against China at that particular moment to get him to sign on to a big offensive against Huawei Technologies, the big Chinese technology company. And Bolton's really smart. He knew how to, you know, work the levers of government. But Bolton is one of those people who would, you know, look at China as, you know, Nazi Germany in the, Nazi Germany in the making. And so he wound up playing to that part of how the president looked at things.
If I can comment, Wendy, on one of the things Bob said that I thought was interesting, and you know, he talked about the two camps, and you know, those who see China as an existential threat and those who don't. And I actually would probably put it a slightly different way. And I think we all actually see China as that level of threat. You know, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to work for this president, was because I felt like we hadn't done enough to push back on China, and that they were really threatening the whole international trading system. Where there really is the difference of opinion is, what do you do about it and how do you engage? And in the book, Bob and Lingling talk about the debates we had over steel. And, you know, I'm characterized as a globalist free trader, I think, at the end of the book, as someone who, you know, wanted to use the threat of steel tariffs to get other trading partners and allies to do the right thing on steel. And again, that is where we were. But again, it was a difference of opinion. In that case, we all thought Chinese excess capacity was the real problem, but our solution, at least, was more targeted. And with respect to China itself, we all see them as an existential threat, but our way of dealing with it is not to completely decouple, but rather to try to engage to change. And another area where this debate is happening right now is on export controls, quite frankly. And I have, you know, I'm not going to sugarcoat what I think are the serious threats from Huawei, but an argument that I have made in policy debates, and I will continue to make, is that if you really think that China's acquisition of data or the security of devices and 5G networks is an issue, you are better off, you know, keeping them dependent on U.S. critical technologies so that you can put security patches into these systems so that you can continue to get revenue to remain ahead of them, and so you can keep them behind in the development curve. And so my answer is, I'm worried about Huawei, but I think by engaging with them is actually a more successful national security strategy than completely disengaging. Mm-hmm. And again, it's a nuanced point. It gets hard to make in this kind of environment. But my answer is, if you're scared about Huawei taking data off of people's phones, let's have U.S. operating systems on those phones so we can protect it. And so it's, again, I don't want to belabor the point, but I think there is a uniform view in the U.S. that we need to deal with China, and the real debate is just how to do it and how do you utilize relationships and how do you utilize engagement to achieve those goals.